well will vaccines work?
How well will vaccines work?
They will not simply eradicate COVID-19.
They will not simply eradicate COVID-19.
Governments need to start thinking about how to live with the virus.
Governments need to start thinking about how to live with the virus.
Even miracles have their limits.
Even miracles have their limits.
Vaccines against the coronavirus have arrived sooner
Vaccines against the coronavirus have arrived sooner
and worked better than many people dared hope.
and worked better than many people dared hope.
Without them, the pandemic threatens to take more than 150 million lives.
Without them, the pandemic threatened to take more than 150 million lives.
Without them, the pandemic threatens to take more than 150 million lives.
Without them, the pandemic threatened to take more than 150 million lives.
And yet, while the world rolls up a sleeve,
while the world rolls up asleep,
it has become clear that expecting vaccines to see off COVID-19 is mistaken.
It has become clear that expecting vaccines to see off the virus is mistaken.
Instead, the disease will circulate for years.
Instead, the disease will circulate for years
And seems likely to become endemic. When COVID-19 first struck, governments were caught by surprise.
When COVID-19 first struck, governments were caught by surprise.
Now they need to think ahead. To call vaccination a miracle is no exaggeration.
To call vaccination a miracle is no exaggeration.
A little more than a year after the virus was first recognized, medics have already administered 148 million doses.
Medics have already administered 148 million doses.
In Israel, the world's champion inoculator, hospital admissions among those aged below 60
who have not received a jab are higher than ever.
By contrast, among the largely inoculated over 60s, they're already nearly 40% below their mid-January peak.
They are already 40% below their mid-January peak.
And they will fall further.
Although
vaccines failed to prevent all mild and asymptomatic cases of COVID-19, they mostly seem to spare patients from death. And the severest infections that require hospital admission. Which is what really matters. Early evidence suggests that some vaccines stop the virus spreading too.
Early evidence suggests that some vaccines stop the virus spreading too.
This would greatly slow the pandemic. And thus make it easier to alleviate lockdowns.
Without causing a surge of cases. That overwhelms intensive care units.
Those findings, and many more, will harden up
Those findings and many more will harden up
over the next few months as more data emerge.
over the next few months as more data emerge.
However, despite all this good news,
And yet, despite all this good
the
news,
coronavirus is not finished with humanity yet.
the coronavirus is not finished with humanity yet.
COVID-19 will continue to circulate widely.
COVID-19 will continue to circulate widely.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans.
As The Jab, our new podcast, which launches on February 15th, will explore.
As The Jab, our new podcast, which launches on February 15th, will explore.
That has profound implications for how governments need to respond. That has profound implications for how governments need to respond. One reason the coronavirus will persist
One reason the coronavirus will persist
is that making and distributing enough vaccine
is the making and distributing enough vaccines
to protect the world's 7.8 billion people
to protect the world's 7.8 billion people
is a Herculean task. Even Britain, which is vaccinating the population at a faster rate than any other big country,
Even Britain, which is vaccinating the population at a faster rate than any other big country,
will not finish with the over 50s until May.
will not finish with the over 50s until May.
To add to the burden, the potency of a jab may fade.
To add to the burden, the potency of a jab may fade,
making boosters necessary. Outside the rich world, 85% of countries
Outside the rich world, 85% of countries
have yet to start their vaccination programs. Until the billions of people who live in them have felt the prick of a needle,
which may not be before 2023,
they will remain fuel for the virus. Another reason for COVID-19's persistence is that even as vaccines are making SARS-CoV-2 less infectious, and protecting people against death, new viral variants are undoing some of their good work. For one thing, successful variants are more infectious. Anything from 25 to 40% in the case of B117.
Anything from 25 to 40% in the case of B117, which was first found in Britain.
Infection is governed by the dizzying mathematics of exponential growth. So cases and deaths accumulate rapidly. the variant is no more deadly.
even if the variant is no more deadly.
To get a given level of viral suppression,
To get a given level of viral suppression,
more onerous social distancing is needed.
more onerous social distancing is needed.
In addition, new variants may withstand current vaccines.
In addition, new variants may withstand current vaccines.
The ones found in Brazil and South Africa
The ones found in Brazil and South Africa
may also be defeating the immunity acquired from a previous COVID-19 infection.
may also defeating the immunity acquired from a previous vaccination.
The hope is that such cases will be milder.
The hope is that such cases will be milder
Because the immune system has been primed by the first encounter with the disease.
because the immune system has been primed by the first encounter with the disease.
Even if that is true, the virus will continue to circulate.
Even if that is true, the virus will continue to circulate.
Finding unprotected people, and because this is what viruses do,
Finding unprotected people, and because that's what the virus do, evolving new strains,
some of which will be better at evading the defenses that societies have mounted against them.
some of which will be better at evading the immune system that societies have mounted against them.
And the third reason SARS-CoV-2 will persist
And the third reason the SARS-CoV-2 will persist
is that lots of people will choose to remain a target
is that lots of people will choose to remain a target
by refusing vaccination.
by refusing vaccination.
A total of 10 million Britons are vulnerable to the disease
A total of 10 million Britons are vulnerable to the disease
because of their age or underlying conditions.
because of their age and their underlying conditions.
Modelling suggests that if just 10% of them
Modeling suggests that if just 10% of them
declined to be vaccinated, and if social distancing were abandoned while the virus was still liable to circulate at high levels,
and if the social distancing were abandoned while the virus is liable to circulate at high levels,
a tremendous spike in infections and deaths would result.
then a tremendous spike in deaths, cases and deaths will result.
In reality, the share of the overall population that remains unvaccinated
In reality, the share of people that remain
is likely unvaccinated. The share of the overall population that remains unvaccinated
in reality, the share of the population that remain
is
unvaccinated
likely to remain much higher than in that thought experiment.
is likely to remain much higher than in that thought experiment.
Vaccines are not yet licensed for children.
Vaccines are not yet licensed for children.
Minority communities in many countries, which are most vulnerable to infection,
Minority communities in many countries which are most vulnerable to infection
have less trust in the government and the medical establishment.
tends to have less trust in the government and the medical establishment.
Even among some care workers, as many as half refuse vaccination.
Even among health care workers, as many as half refuse vaccination.
Despite having seen the ravages of COVID-19 at first hand.
Despite seeing the ravages of COVID-19 at first hand.
With the new variants, about 80% of the overall population
With the new variants, about 80% of the overall population
needs to be immune for an infected person on average
needs to be immune for an infected person on average.
To pass on the disease to less than one contact.
To pass on the disease to less than one contact.
The threshold at which the epidemic subsides.
Threshold at which the epidemic subsides.
That will be a tall order.
That will be a tall order.
For all these reasons, governments need to start planning for COVID-19.
For all these reasons, governments need to start planning for COVID-19
as an endemic
as an endemic disease.
disease. Today they treat it as an emergency that will pass.
Today they treat it as an emergency that will pass.
To see how those ways of thinking differ,
To see how those ways of thinking differ,
consider New Zealand, which is thought to be COVID-free,
consider New Zealand, which has thought to be COVID-free,
by bolting its doors against the world.
by bolting its doors against the world.
In this way, it has kept registered deaths down to just 25.
In this way, they have managed to keep the registered death down to 25.
Draconian policy makes no sense as a permanent defense.
But such a draconian policy makes no sense as a permanent defense.
New Zealand is not North Korea.
New Zealand is not North Korea.
As vulnerable Kiwis are vaccinated,
As vulnerable Kiwis are vaccinated,
their country will come under growing pressure to open its borders.
the country will come under growing pressure to open its borders,
And hence to start to tolerate endemic COVID-19 infections. Hence to start to tolerate endemic COVID-19 infections and deaths.
and hence to tolerate endemic infections and death.
Across the world, governments will have to work out
Across the world, governments will have to work out
when and how to switch from emergency measures
when and how to switch from emergency measures
to policies that are economically and socially sustainable indefinitely.
to policies that are economically and socially sustainable indefinitely.
The transition will be politically hard
The transition will be politically hard
in places that have invested a lot in being COVID-free.
in places that have invested a lot in being COVID-free.
Nowhere more so than China, where vaccination is slow.
Nowhere more so than in China, where the vaccination is slow.
The Communist Party has defined every case of COVID-19 as unacceptable.
The Communist Party has defined any case of COVID-19 as unacceptable,
And wide circulation of the disease as a sign of the decadence of Western democracies.
and a widespread of COVID-19 as the decadence of Western societies.
The adjustment to living with COVID-19
The adjustment to living with COVID-19
begins with medical science.
begins with medical science.
Work has already started on tweaking vaccines
Work has already started on tweaking vaccines
to confer protection against variants.
to confer protection against variants.
That should go along with more surveillance of mutations that are spreading. That should go along with more surveillance of mutations that are spreading
That should go along with more surveillance on the mutations that are spreading
and accelerated regulatory approval for booster shots.
and accelerated regulatory approval for booster shots.
Meanwhile, treatments will be required to save more of those
Meantime, treatments will be required to save more of those
the disease from death or serious illness.
who contract the disease from death or serious illness.
The best outcome would be for a combination of acquired immunity,
The best outcome would be for a combination of acquired immunity,
regular booster jabs of tweaked
regular booster jabs of tweaked vaccines,
vaccines, and a menu of therapies to ensure that COVID-19 need rarely be life-threatening.
and a menu of therapies to ensure that the COVID-19 need rarely be life-threatening.
But that outcome is not guaranteed.
But that outcome is not guaranteed.
To the extent that medicine alone cannot prevent lethal outbreaks of COVID-19,
To the extent that medicine cannot alone prevent the lethal infections of COVID-19,
the burden will also fall on behavior.
the burden will also fall on behavior,
Just as it has in most of the pandemic.
just it has in most of the pandemic.
But rather than national lockdowns and months-long school closures,
But rather than national lockdowns and months-long school closures,
which come at a huge price,
the responsibility should fall more heavily on individuals.
Habits like mask wearing may become part of everyday life.
Habits like mask wearing may become part of everyday life.
Vaccine passports and restrictions in crowded spaces
Vaccine
become mandatory.
Vaccine passports and restrictions in crowded places may become mandatory.
Vulnerable people will have to maintain great vigilance.
Vulnerable people will have to maintain great vigilance.
Those who refuse vaccination can expect health education.
Those who refuse vaccination can expect health education
and encouragement but limited protection. As our special report on the travel industry makes clear, people's desire to live their lives will ultimately be hard to resist.
People's desire to live their lives will ultimately be hard to resist.
Even in autocracies like China that may be reluctant to leave zero tolerance behind.
Even in autocracies like China, which are reluctant to leave zero tolerance behind.
The persistence of acute infections and chronic debilitating long COVID. The persistence of acute infections and chronic debilitating long COVID.
The persistence of acute infections and chronic debilitating long COVID means that the next stage of the pandemic sounds grim.
But even if COVID-19 has not been completely put to rest,
But even if the COVID-19 has not yet been put to rest completely, the situation is immeasurably better than what might have been.
The credit for that goes to medical science.
The credit for that goes to medical science.